A few people are still gathering, but I'll make a few introductions as they filter in here. And I promise to use my Hoosier hog call voice. I grew up on a dairy and hog farm in Indiana and had to call the hogs and cows every evening. And I can do that. So I think we don't have to use amplification other than my lungs. But welcome to this annual Halloween cemetery tour. We're going to be proceeding not through every gravestone here, but several significant ones. Some very interesting folk who reside out there and some real historical events that occurred out there in the old Quaker boneyard. So let me see just a few things by introduction of this place and who I am. I'm Max Carter. I'm Director of Friends Center at Guilford College, and I'm a member of this meeting, a New Garden Friends meeting, which began as a worship group here in 1751. So 25 years before the American Revolution and a good 50 years before there was a Greensboro, there was a settled Quaker community here. So the cemetery goes back that far. And you'll note in the very middle of it, there are very few gravestones. Quakers didn't allow gravestones until the early 1800s, essentially. So a lot of the gravestones in the middle were later descendants who went back and marked their ancestors' graves, because we do have records of who's plugged in there. But it was seen as a vain and worldly thing to have a gravestone until, and then if you know your sociology of American religion, you can see the assimilation of Quakers into the mainstream as you go from no gravestones to very simple gravestones to mausoleums, and we're Protestant suddenly, but quite a good mix in there, and I'll try to fill a little of those details in, but feel free to ask questions along the way. So we will head through a small opening here in the hedge. Watch your steps, because there are gravestones in there, because this is the outer circle, and be careful there. A few people walked in there and tripped a little bit. And there is a wall, a hedge around the cemetery. You know why they put a wall around cemeteries, don't you?
No.
People are just dying to get in. Okay, got married, and nearly 70 years later, they're still happily married and had a whole bunch of kids who also went to Guilford. We want to start there to let you know that you don't have to worry about walking through a Quaker cemetery. Everyone here isn't even dead. And Quakers are benign in death as they are in life anyway, so don't have to worry. Okay, the spirits have left a couple little tokens here symbolic of Dick Dyer, who's buried here. Dick was a wonderful Quaker minister from up in Maine who worked here at Guilford and passed away in 1997 at the young age of about 47 or 48. He was giving a talk in the Moon Room, one of our assembly halls over in Dana Auditorium, to parents who had just dropped their children off for their first day at Guilford College. His talk was how to say goodbye.
Oh, no.
And he dropped dead in a massive heart attack. Dick went out with as much of aplomb as he lived life. Dick was an expert quilter. And if any of you knew Dick, and some of you here I know knew him, he shook like a leaf. But when he was quilting, he had the most perfect stitches. One of the things that I remember about Dick is in his last year, he gave a talk at our college meeting for worship. Dick, being from Maine, knew the last remaining Shakers of Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, and he had collected a lot of Shaker furniture and memorabilia. He had a wonderful Shaker children's rocker, and he titled his talk, A Sorta Kinda Life. He was in the dean's office, the dean of student life office. His job was to work with the most at-risk students, those who are in risk of failing out because of bad decisions they had made. And he would often have people come into his office, ask, okay, now, have you been studying? Have you been reading your work? Have you been behaving yourself? Well, sorta, kinda. And he would start off his sermon talking about that sorta, kinda life. Said, now the Shakers, on the other hand, did everything to perfection. And he picked up his children's rocker and showed at the bottom of it, where the light hadn't gotten to it, the dies were as perfect as as it was made 150 years ago. This is not that rocker. He checked out the joints. They were as sturdy as they were when it was built 150 years ago. And setting it up on top of a table, he started rocking. And it continued to rock the rest of his talk. It was that perfectly built and balanced. And his closing line was, the Shakers didn't lead a sorta, kinda life, and neither should you.
Entire school was in uproar. Well,
you know how Quakers are about water.
I'm glad that they have such luxuries. But anyway, enjoy your food. Food is one of the joys of life, and so is water. You have good courage, and good night.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Here at Guilford College, and we used to have an octagonal barn out on the baseball field in center field. You can imagine my horses today, they get a little skittish with all the line drives and center fielders running through there. But we used to keep chickens and calves and horses. That whole lake back there used to be a pasture with a lovely stream running through it, and now it's dammed up in a lake, woods, regrowth. It's all beautiful. But yeah, I used to grow the food here on campus. People used to rely on me to supply them with their meat and dairy and eggs and all the corn that we were discussing. But now, you know, the students, they can just cross Friendly Avenue and go to those fancy food emporiums.
I hear we're growing some food on campus again, though.
Yeah, they got like a mechanical horse out there that, you know, tills the land and stuff. And, you know, I heard they're really good people, but I think y'all should probably check it out for yourselves. Don't take my word for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Cornelius.
Thanks. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you. Construction South, and his son became mayor of Greensboro. And he owned lots and lots of land around here they had nurseries on. The Arboretum in Greensboro was one of his nurseries. Lindley Fields, where PTI is now, used to be a nursery. You see Lindley all over the place. He was a very important business person. And one of his workers, another little Quaker, Addison Boren, he commissioned to make terracotta pipe to drain the swampy nurseries. And he developed quite a business out of it. It's over around Norwalk Street, I understand. Big, huge factories cranking out terracotta pipe and eventually brick. It's made out of the same red clay. And an African-American community developed around that. He hired a lot of recently emancipated African-Americans to work there, and the community became known as Terracotta. Now, I understand there's still a few of those old mill homes left, and they have terracotta days every fall, thanks to Addison Boren. Most of the reason that we keep losing water at Guilford is it's mostly 150-year-old terracotta pipe underneath that camp.
Amongst everybody. What has happened to Guilford College? What in the world? Quaker Village, all these dab-bling places? Archdale Hall's not a dorm anymore? Cox Hall's turned into some kind of dab-bling art museum or something? What in the world? My one regret is I wasn't good enough to teach here. You know, too higher standards for me, but, you know, I admit it, but I wish I could have made it. I would have just loved to have been a part of 64, the greatest graduating class in the history of Guilford College. It would have been wonderful, only surpassed by 62. But anyway, it's so good to be back, and thank you so much. I'll read you one of my famous poems. I know you'll get as much of it as I did trying to write this thing. Okay. From my mother's sleep I fell into the stake, and I launched into its belly till my wet went froze. 6 miles from earth, loosened from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turnip with a hose. Made no sense to me either.
Great anti-war poem, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. Randall Jarrell, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, here we're in God's little Guilford acre. We got a bunch of folk really significant in Guilford's history buried here. The first president of Guilford College, Lewis Lyndon Hobbs, buried here next to his parents, Lewis and Phoebe Hobbs. We'll see Lewis later on as one of the teachers in the old Sabbath school over there. It was built in 1816. Next to Lewis is a very significant character, not only in Quaker history, but in national history. Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. She was.
Excuse me, may I come through?
There she is, Mary.
Guys, I'm so sorry to be a little late. It takes me a while to get around these days.
We all have those aches and pains,
Well,
Mary.
you know, it seems to me that there's been a lot of things going on this semester, a little bit that I know we've been putting out some fires around here.
Yeah, but some of them financial, some of them a student, and some of them real.
Rampant. And not only at my namesake, Mary Hobbs Hall, thankfully it was more smoke than fire. But I understand our other sister, UNCG, has been having a few heat waves there as
A few
well.
hiccups down there.
And I think, you know, our renovation at Mary Hobbs Hall is going to continue. But I also think the heat at UNCG may continue as well for a while. Now, some of you may know that the forerunner of UNCG was the North Carolina Normal School for Women, which I advocated for in the 1880s, and it actually came to fruition after my persuasive talk at the legislature, General Assembly, and they agreed to start a normal school for girls. And it was right here at UNCG. First, the North Carolina Normal School, then Women's College, and now UNCG. Now, a little known fact, however, is that my great uncle George Mendenhall, who was a state senator, provided land not too far from here in Jamestown and started a school for girls as well. And that was in 1859, I believe. In 1861, they had a fire and the school was no more. Well, now, Uncle George had died in 1860, so he was no longer around to refinance the school. So it lay dormant for a while, but High Point picked up the challenge, and it is now what we know as High Point University. But that had its beginnings in Jamestown at a Mendenhall-funded school. So you see, I grew up in a culture of education, particularly concerns for education of women. And I leave it to those of you here after me to continue the passion and the burning in your soul for education for women and equality in all things.
Could they use any funding for those renovations?
They could use money for the renovations. The renovations will happen, the restorations of the original architectural designs, which are so crucial, will not be done until we do raise the money. So any of you with a few extra coins in your pocket may drop them into the kitty at any time.
Just one question, Mary. Is there a bronze statue of you lounging around on a bench over that High Point University?
There are some bricks from the old school in Jamestown on a plaque, but I don't know about any bronze statue yet.
Well, we'll have to get to working on old Nito about that. Thank you, Mary. 1934 to 1965, 31 years. And it was during World War II that Clyde Milner, working with some of the other presidents and heads of Quaker schools and colleges, brought Japanese Americans out of intern camps to study at the school. There are pictures on campus you can see of some of them on our basketball team. They played on our football team. They were well integrated into the campus, but not overly popular in Greensboro. It was during the 1960s under his presidency that Guilford College integrated. as he was planning his retirement, he wanted the feather in his broad-brim hat to be the gathering of worldwide Quakerdom on the campus in 1967. At that time, about every 15 years, worldwide Quakers would gather. Swarthmore College in 37, Pendle Hill, Lancaster, England in 1952, and they wanted it here in Greensboro at Guilford in 1967. But half the world's Quakers are in Africa. They're people of color. They were not going to gather on a segregated campus in the segregated South, and so they went to work figuring out how do they get ahead of the culture and integrate the school. And they did that by bringing African Quakers, Kenyan Quakers, to study here in 1962. And when the sky didn't fall in, then they quietly brought in African American Quakers. James McCorkle, I think, was the first. Some of you were here at the time that happened, and can tell us anything you'd like to say about that, those of you who were here. They're Quakers. They're very silent. Yeah, it wasn't a big deal.
No. They were wonderful soccer players.
Yeah. With the German National Banking Association in the 1930s, but was Jewish. His wife was Christian. They had joined the National Church to try to protect themselves from the rise of Nazism, but by 1939 they desperately needed to get out. In December of 1938, 3 Quakers from Philadelphia, Jones, Yarnell, and Walton, had steamed off to Berlin with a plan that Quakers had put together with the cooperation of the American Jewish community to get 50,000 Jews out of Germany, knowing the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht, and the rise of Nazism, that they needed to do something to address their suffering. And their plans were accepted, in large part because Quakers had gone over after World War I to save German children from starvation. They saved about 1,200,000 German children with their soup kitchens, organized by the American Friends Service Committee, often using chocolate soup, because they got all that free and cheap cocoa from the Cadburys, Roundtrees, and Fries, the Quakers who had cornered the cocoa market in England. And they didn't have to twist the kids' arms to get them to eat the chocolate soup. And so they had a good name in Germany, and when the Quakers presented these plans to the Nazis in Berlin in '38, they accepted them. And until the war broke out the following fall, they got thousands of Jews and others out of Germany. Eventually, the Victoriouses landed here, where he became head of the economics department. Those of you who, any here from Earlham, any connections with Earlham? Manfred Bloom, who established the Whitewater Opera, also was one of those Jews who came out of Germany with Quaker assistance. And Bruno Bettelheim, the famous psychologist, also was one of those that Quakers aided. Of New Garden during the latter stages of the American Revolutionary War. March 15, 1781, British and American troops engaged in about 2 hours of skirmishes all around the old meeting house that we'll see the site of in a moment, all around the graveyard, spilling over into the grounds that are now Guilford College, the famous Ghost and Dana Auditorium. Lucas, supposedly, is one of those soldiers who died in those skirmishes. It was Nathaniel Greene, the disowned Quaker from Rhode Island, General Nathaniel Greene, and Light Horse Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father, who led the American troops against Cornwallis and Tarleton, leading the British troops. Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, in her autobiography, says that growing up, she heard stories from people who, in their latter years, still remembered those battles, said there were between 125 and 150 dead from those skirmishes around here, and hundreds more wounded mortally. Many of them were laid out in the old meeting house as a field hospital. Others were laid out under the massive branches of this tree. And ever after, it was known as the Revolutionary Oak. It became the iconic emblem of this community. Well, in the mid-1950s, Quakers were agitating for the desegregation of the local public schools. They had written letters to the local paper Many of those Quakers lost their businesses downtown because of that. Others had crosses burned in their yards, KKK marching around their houses. They paid an awful price for that, but they continued to work towards desegregation, especially after Brown versus Board of Education in '54. And as part of that, they invited Eleanor Roosevelt to come here and speak on civil rights in the old meeting house over on campus to an intentionally mixed audience of blacks and whites sitting together. The local press and segregationists called it a promiscuous mingling of the races. And they were pretty angry with the Quakers and figured we got to do something to get back at them. So while Eleanor Roosevelt was speaking over there in New Garden, what's now New Garden Hall, some scalawags came out here and laid dynamite at the base of this tree and blew it up. They could hear the rumble over there across the street. It was so massive that it didn't bring it down immediately, but a few years later in the storm it did come down, 1959. So we made furniture out of it. If any of you join us for hot drinks in the fellowship hall, you can touch the very wood of the old tree here in the Brotherhood room table. When the tree came down and they counted the rings, they discovered it was born in 1492. '50s came from Nantucket. Nantucket. By Priscilla Coffin.
Hello, Max.
Hey, thanks for showing up again.
Good evening.
Got good timing.
Yeah. Every year. And like Max said, I came with a group in the 1770s from Nantucket Island. Big whaling community, a strong woman, would take care of all the homes while the men were off whaling. And like Max said, just about a few years after I moved here, the battles broke out, and there were men all over the place, all in our fields, and we took them in. But being strong Nantucket women did not catch any smallpox, luckily. But for that, for their bravery and for burying those men side by side, my husband received an honor. But of course, I was not rewarded. Matt can tell you a little bit more about that.
Yeah, he is William Coffin, born in Nantucket. Your epitaph also says proudly born in Nantucket. He's an honorary son of the American Revolution. The whirring sound you hear in the distance is him turning in his grave. The story is that the local chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, during their research, discovered that Priscilla and William indeed took fallen soldiers into their farmhouse along New Garden Road. The skirmishes not only fought around here, but they fought all along New Garden Road out to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And there were dead and dying all along there. Algie Newell, in his history of the Battle of New Garden, says that when he was a student at Guilford College in the early 1900s, for recreation, they would go out and dig around in these shallow graves and find bullets and cloth and hanks of hair and things like that. And the coffins brought in American soldiers.
Evidently, we didn't bury them very deep.
Didn't bury them very deep. No, they didn't. They might have ruptured a water line or something.
Yeah, I knew that would happen.
Yeah.
I was looking out for y'all.
And so the local chapter said he qualifies. He may have been a Quaker pacifist because they helped American soldiers. He qualified as the son of the American Revolution. And in the last paragraph in the article in the paper the next day, he said, oh, yeah, they helped British soldiers too. But because they helped American soldiers, he qualified. Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you.
See you next year. I do have to, I'll acknowledge all these wonderful interpreters at the end, but I do have to mention Priscilla's a direct descendant of William and Priscilla Coffin.
Yeah, as well as Levi Coffin.
As well as Levi, who we'll talk about later on. But somehow she wound up in Southern California.
But back here again.
Okay, back here. Captaining our volleyball team. Still a strong woman. Grove Skipper Bowl. A lot of you locals know gubernatorial candidate, famous citizen of North Carolina, and his son Erskine ran for Senate, was the chief of staff in the White House in the Clinton years, and recently the chancellor of the UNC system. With an election coming up on Tuesday and a few hiccups at that other UNC school down the road, we thought we ought to pay honor to old Skipper. I think there's some whirring going on here too. Guilford for into 40-some years, I think. Who knows exactly? 41, something like that. Jack was a beloved coach and is in several halls of fame because he has that unique distinction of having won national championships in 2 different sports. With the 1973 basketball team at Guilford, he won the national championship out of Kansas City with 3 future NBA players on that team. M.L. Carr, World B. Free, and Greg Jackson. Not a bad team. Later on, he won 2 national championships in golf. That's all the golf balls down here. Okay, right next to us, on my left, your right, in this little grove of what looked to be maple trees, used to be the site of the old yearly meeting house that was used as a field hospital during the battles of Newgard and Guilford Courthouse. The British troops used it as a field hospital, laid out their dead and dying in there. And that was then torn down in the early 1790s and replaced by a large yearly meeting house that served the local congregation of Quakers and the statewide assembly of Friends. It stood there until 1872, and it was replaced by a brick building over on campus. That building eventually was given to New Garden boarding schools. That became the Friends School in the Carolinas as it transitioned to become Guilford College in 1889. And when that brick building that replaced this one was turned into a classroom and boys' dormitory around 1885, it was renamed King Hall after the Baltimore Quaker that helped save the Southern Quaker community after the Civil War by pouring money and expertise in here, and it pretty quickly burned down. Those bricks were then cleaned up and taken across campus to build Archdale Hall, which still stands, in the oldest building on the main quad, but built of bricks of the old meeting house. It was initially called Phoenix Hall because it rose out of the ashes, but when Francis King himself came down here for the dedication, proper old Quaker in Baltimore that he was, says, don't name it after some mythological bird, name it after a Quaker. And so they named it after the Quaker governor, John Archdale, when this was a Quaker colony back in the 1690s. Some of you I knew lived in Archdale Hall when you were students here. How many of you here? I know Elwood did.
I did.
Brooks, did you? Yeah. I heard stories that when it was being renovated a few years ago, back to its original shape, some of you snuck over there to see if any of those old alcohol bottles were still stuck behind the wainscoting where you hid them. That made were on the faculty at the school, and Waldo Woody bought land after the Civil War and made it available to the recently emancipated when they couldn't buy land. And that land became known as Woody Side. It's right across Market Street along College Road, back behind where Hedgecock used to be. Okay, we got some baseballs here. Here's another one over here, another baseball, a couple old clear bubblegum baseball cards. Rick and Wes Farrell. The Farrells belonged to New Garden Meeting. They were dairy farmers out along what's now Market Street. I think Hidden Lakes was their dairy farm. I backed up to Western Guilford High School. And they evidently felt it was better to sit in the bullpen than to feed bulls on the farm, and they all became professional baseball players. Rick Farrell became one of the most famous catchers of his era. He's in the Hall of Fame. His card here says that he had a career batting average of .283, which isn't bad for a catcher who was known for his defense more than his hitting. His brother Wes, his card says, would have made it into the Hall of Fame had not blown out his arm and had such a hot temper. But I don't know how hot a temper he could have. He had the absolute model of Quaker egalitarianism. In his career, he won 193 games and lost 193 games. There's a famous story about them when they were growing up on the dairy farm. They would often play baseball out on the pasture field, and they would try to outdo each other in hitting the ball. And when they would hit the ball, they would, stick a stake where they had hit it and then try to hit further than that. And so the story goes, once Rick hit a home run off of his brother who was pitching for the opposing team in the majors, and was pretty upset about that. And when Wes got up, who was a really good hitting pitcher, he hit one even farther. And as he was rounding the bases, yelled back to Rick, "Put a stake in it, Rick."
I think I just felt a couple raindrops.
Okay, we will try to hustle this along. I'll bring you around the front here. Okay, this is a pretty significant little spot, especially for those of us connected with Guilford. This is the site of the first purpose-built brick schoolhouse for the New Garden Friends community, built in 1816. Now, Quakers always had schools attached to their local congregations. When Quakers began in England in the 1600s as nonconformists, having left the Church of England, they weren't allowed in Oxford and Cambridge or the church's schools. There were no public schools at the time. So Quakers had to establish their own schools. And furthermore, they believed in the education of boys and girls. So they're all either co-educational or they were schools for both boys and girls. And since at that time Quakers had no ordained clergy, everyone had to be able to read the Bible, the histories. They had to be able to lead. So education was very important. They said of the Quakers on the frontier in America that the wheels of their covered wagons had barely stopped rolling before they'd built a school. And they built schools, they had schools here before 1816, but it was in the meeting house, or it was in private homes, or it was in little log cabins. But they built in 1816 this school that served the community. But in 1821, very significantly, they opened it as a Sabbath school for enslaved Africans. And it's Uncle Frank, one of the first students there. Well, welcome. You show up every year too. This is great.
I show up every year.
Yeah.
And, we went to this school, and I had one of my prayers that I used to say. And it goes like, I pray that the good Master Lord will put into the Negroes' hearts to learn to read the good book. Oh Lord, make the letters in our spelling books big and plain, and make our eyes bright and shining, and make our hearts big and strong to learn. Make our minds sharp and keen, yes Lord, as sharp as the double-edged sword, so that we can see clean through the book. Oh Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for making our masters willing to let us come to this school, and oh Lord, do bless the dear young man You have made willing. Let us come and learn, poor slave, to read the blessed Lord in the mouth of God. Oh Lord, teach us to be good servants and touch our masters' hearts, and make them tender so that they do not lay the whips in our bare backs, and the great master shall have all the glory and praise.
Yep, I can see it through the camera light. It's starting to rain.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Uncle Frank.
Thank you.
Indeed. For several months, they opened the school on the Sabbath when they weren't using it for their own school children, purposefully to teach literacy to a population that was by law forbidden to learn how to read. The back door was teaching them how to read the Bible. They had to work hard to find progressive slave owners willing to do that. But within 3 months, less enlightened slave owners, saying that it was making their slaves restless, closed the school. And if you take a look at the list of teachers here, you'll recognize that almost half of them spent their natural days up in Indiana and Ohio, joined those mass migrations of Quakers out of the South. Elijah Coffin was the clerk of the yearly meeting here, first cousin to Levi Coffin, who by this time was farming with his wife Katie, the eastern part of what's now the campus. He became known when he left for Indiana as the president of the Underground Railroad. His and his wife's home in what was then Newport, now Fountain City, Indiana, became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. Between 2,000 and 3,000 slaves went through that home to their freedom. Vestal Coffin will visit a bit later on. He was the first known conductor of the Underground Railroad here. Horace Cannon, another teacher in the school, migrated to the north. His son, Joseph Gurney Cannon, was in the first class of Earlham College and went on to be a congressman from a district in Illinois for 46 consecutive years and became the Speaker of the House of Representatives. 1905 to 1911 was on the cover of the first Time magazine. So some pretty significant folk here, but all of them had to leave. Have heart, only a few more. We'll dodge the raindrops. As I mentioned when we began at the Macon's grave, you don't even have to be dead to be here. You don't even have to be Quaker to be buried here. And this is a good example of that. Vance Havner was a member of First Baptist Church down here in his later years, but he was most well known as an evangelist. He traveled with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Crusade. Any of you know of Vance Havner back in the day? He was quite famous, an author and humorist. He's well known for one of his statements that describing American religion said, most worship in American churches begins at 11 o'clock sharp and ends at 12 o'clock dull. If you remember, one of the teachers on that list of folk over in the old school was Vestal Coffin, the first cousin to Levi Coffin, another one of that Coffin family. Here's his grave. Vestal Coffin, in the old Quaker plain language, born 10th of 10th month, 1792, died 10th of 10th month, 1826. Born and died the same day. Didn't live long. He was the first known conductor of the Underground Railroad here. In 1819, known for his abolitionist sentiments, he had often memorialized the legislature against slavery. He was involved in the manumission societies, very active in working against slavery. One night at his farmhouse along New Garden Road, John Demery, an enslaved African downtown, was escorted out here by another enslaved African, Hamilton Saul, who was hoping to help him get to freedom. And that night, they conspired to figure out how to get him up to Indiana and Ohio along the same route Quakers were using leaving the South, up over what's now Mount Airy, through the Blue Ridge, up to Charleston, West Virginia, along the Kanawha, down to Ohio, often by steamer, and then several routes up to Canada, where they were finally free. If you take a look at his epitaph, long epitaph, but long, hast thou lain here, mourned still by thy widow Althea, who died in 1891. So obviously this was put here much later. And here's Althea, his widow. For the longest time, when I would read hers, there's only one line epitaph, died in Indiana. Until I dug down a little further a few years back, and it says, buried in her wedding dress. The story is that when he died in 1826 and joined that long wagon train of Quakers out of here because of their involvement in anti-slavery work, she found the wagon too bouncy. And so she walked to Indiana. And then when Nereus Mendenhall, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs' father, was helping keep the school open as principal during the Civil War, but even before that, needed a matron for their women, she came back from Indiana to head up that work. And then later on, when those services were no longer needed, she went back to Indiana, where she died in 1891, was brought back here and buried in her wedding dress. Now, the two unusual things about that are, one, she held on to that thing and all those trips back and forth in 1826 and 1891, and she still fit in her wedding dress. If you walk that many miles, you probably would too. I think I see John Demery. Oh my goodness.
Hello, I am John Demery, and that was 195 years ago when Mr. Vestal and the others of the community helped me in a time of need, and I could never forget that.
Wow. Can you say anything about what happened after you left here?
Well, really not much is known about what happened to me after I got into the free states. So maybe one of the young students here will find that history and make it known.
Okay, there you go, Shannon.
All right.
You got your next research project. John Demery, thank you. Well, you've been a great crowd. This is our last stop. We've dodged the raindrops, and you've dodged a whole lot of other history here. You can be grateful. But I wanted to stop here in our last stop and just mention some of these names that give some evidence of where these friends came from who are buried here. And before I mention the Starbucks and the Stanleys and the True Bloods here, I just want to mention that right behind you, somewhere, it's not marked, we have no records for it, there are two Union soldiers buried. Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, in her memoirs, talks about how during the Civil War, two Union soldiers escaped the Confederate prison here in town and made their way out here to the Quaker community. They're desperately ill. Nereus Mendenhall, her father, was a physician, but had stopped his practice to teach at the school and then headed up. And he called another doctor in. They couldn't save them, but they buried them here in their Quaker cemetery. But they're unmarked. We don't know, but they're somewhere in there, because when you check the records about dates when people are buried, that's about where it would be. So we have at least 3 Union soldiers in here, those 2 unknown ones, and old John Van Lindley. But back to Starbucks. The Starbucks came from Nantucket. There were specific names that came out of Nantucket. Starbucks was one, Gardeners, Coffins, Folgers, all the coffee names, and Macy's. The department store started as a general store for the Quaker population there before it burned, and they moved to New York. But the Starbucks coffee chain is not Quaker in origin, like those chocolate folk in England. The company borrowed the name from Moby Dick. Starbuck, the coffee-swilling first mate in Moby Dick. That's where they got the name, but he was a Starbuck from Nantucket. For a couple of years, we had a couple Starbucks on our baseball team. They were from over in Kernersville. Those would be descended from those Nantucket Quakers. And the other name you'll see here that some of you may know is Trueblood. Elton Trueblood, his family was of English stock, and they settled in the eastern part of North Carolina, not too far from over there in Woodland, over there in Pasquotank and Perquimans counties. And he started his academic career here at Guilford. Now usually we end the tour here with a bunch of Starbucks coffee donated by them. They didn't do that for us this year. But in the fellowship hall, if you're interested, we've got some hot water and cocoa and tea, and you're welcome to come in and warm yourselves up and chat if you'd like. If you have any questions, I'll be over there, and maybe some of our interpreters will as well. But I want to acknowledge our interpreters. Some of them may still be here. If you are, come on up. We first met Lizzie Cox. That was Laura Todd, who's a junior at Guilford College and is our clerk of our Interfaith Council at the college, and as you can tell, in our theater department. Do we have Randall Jarrell here? Brooks Hayworth. Randall Jarrell. Cornelius Knight, our farmer, is Nick Mangilli, who's the farmer at Guilford. He is our new farm manager. So if you've got any questions about farming at Guilford, if you eat at Lucky 32 or have a CSA or ever eat in our cafeteria, you're eating the product of his and a lot of other students' work. Thank you, Nick. Priscilla Coffin is Kelsey Ruling, 3rd year from California, and captain or co-captain of our volleyball team? Co-captain. Egalitarianism here, all about equality. Do we have Mary Mendenhall Hobbs with us? That's Carolyn Harmon, member of our meeting, and a Hobbit. She went to school at Guilford and was in the Hobbs Hall and heading up the renovation project. Eve Dusain. Eve. Uncle Frank. There you are. Eve is a 2nd year student, son of a Quaker pastor from Rwanda. And Eve is very active in our Quaker Leadership Scholars Program. And helping us interpret Emily Levering was Nicole Klein around here. Did a lot of research on the Leverings when she was here. Now working on a master's dissertation on Francis King. If you have any questions about him, ask Nicole. There's Nicole. She just sent her dissertation off to Ben Pink Dandelion, my favorite Quaker ethnic name. Pink Dandelion. Did I miss anybody? Any of our interpreters? The last one, okay. Travis Mangum. Right, John Demery. Travis Mangum. The first time I learned where Vestal Coffin's grave was through Travis. On the 10th of October, Travis will walk from his home in East Greensboro out here to the grave in commemoration of how important Vestal Coffin is in the history of the Underground Railroad, and to commemorate that and to give honor to old Vestal. All righty, you're certainly welcome to come into the fellowship hall and have something hot to drink. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.